Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very sorry I can't be with you physically this evening. I've been looking forward to it for months. But I assure you, I'm with you in spirit. In fact, I suspect my spirit has never really left the old school in these last 60 years. My connection with Ironside began long before I was born. My father, Bill Macklin, was a pupil there when it was a one-room timber building in the early 1920s. His best friend was Ernie Wagner, whose father was the headmaster. Ernie became my godfather and one of Brisbane's leading dentists. And after leaving Ironside, my father became an apprentice bookbinder, and during the Great Depression, like so many others, he lost his job. At that time, the government developed relief schemes for the unemployed, and my father joined the team that built the Ironside Oval. Apparently, the scheme ended before they got to the actual topsoil and the grass, and generations of hardy footballers, cricketers and athletics competitors paid for it with scrapes and cuts and bruises on the rock-hard surface. By the time I was born in 1941, we were living in Sundridge Street, Taringa. Dad was in the Air Force, and after the war in 1946, I began the daily trek up Sevenoaks Street, Lambert Road, through the Five Ways, up Swan Road to Carmody Street, and finally down Hawken Drive to Ironside. These were the most wonderful years of my life, at least in retrospect. There were, of course, plenty of ups and downs, but unquestionably they were the most formative and the most luminously memorable. In 1951, we moved from Sundridge Street to the Five Ways, where my parents had bought a grocery shop, and this cut the distance to school almost by half. And by then I was riding my bike there and to Sunday school at the Methodist Church down the other direction of Carmody Street to the river. Our class was a big one. We were the war babies, not the past-war boomers, but at the time, St. Lucia was filling up as the university expanded and the first of the European migrants arrived. By grade 6 or 7, we had no fewer than 73 in our year, and the classes were split in two. We had started with Miss Crawford in Prep 1, and here I must leap ahead a little. In 2003, after I'd moved to Canberra and married my lovely wife, written and published some 11 books, I was approached by John Templeman, the publisher of the Australian National University's Pandanus Books imprint. He'd published Albert Facey's A Fortunate Life and had an idea for a book of a group of authors writing about their formative years. He asked me if I'd write 4,000 words about growing up in Queensland. Naturally, I agreed and set to. But once I started, I was overwhelmed by these wonderful memories with Ironside School right at the centre of them. And in almost no time at all, instead of 4,000 words, I'd written 40,000. Somewhat embarrassed, I sent them off to Mr. Templeman with an apologetic note. A few days later, he called to say he changed his mind. Now, if I could do another 30,000, he'd publish it as a book on his own. The result was War Babies. And that's the good news. The bad news is that not long afterwards, the ANU had a new Vice-Chancellor who almost wrecked the place with his penny-pinching regime, and soon Pandanus Books was no more. So copies of War Babies are very hard to find. However, I'll quote a couple of passages which I think will give you a feel for the school at the time. We started in the little school, a wooden building beside the big brick one that at the time was getting its second story. My first day, I wrote, the little school smelled like 100 squashed bananas. There were kids everywhere, and some of the girls were crying, especially Carolee Cox. She was bellowing and whimpering at the same time. I wasn't sad exactly. I was quite excited, but there was an ache in my heart when my mother left, and my mouth felt dry. Then Miss Crawford took over. She was a bit like my grandmother, but with freckles and muscles. Her dress came down almost to her ankles. Her shoes were thick and hard, and you could hear her walking down the wooden veranda of the little school towards our classroom. We all had to sit up straight, hands on desks, eyes on the blackboard. Actually, the blackboard was green, but it was not a good idea to correct Miss Crawford. She liked her class to be very quiet. The only sound she liked was slate pencils on slate. Each morning, 2 people gave out the slates, and quite often I was one of them. It was actually work giving out the slates, but you didn't mind, because Miss Crawford made it seem like an honour. The slates were just uneven slices of grey slate with lines scored on them. The slate pencils were thin, and you had to keep them sharpened so they made clear, light grey marks on the slate. Then you had a wet cloth and a dry cloth to clean the slate. When you dried it, you had to rub it lightly. If you flicked it with your dry cloth, which was really much quicker, it made a snapping sound, which Miss Crawford did not like. She gave you one warning, and the next time she called you out the front and gave you the wax. Miss Crawford's wax were famous. She put 2 rulers together, and when they hit, they pinched the skin of your leg. She only hit the boys, and sometimes Carolee Cox, who couldn't stop talking. But that was after about 8 warnings. Then she couldn't stop crying. It still takes you back. I learned much later that the same year we started, so too did the headmaster, Mr. Murray. In many ways, he was the figure who really got Ironsides on the road to the top. But to us pupils, I wrote, Mr. Murray was the scariest man in the world. He had the skin like a Chinaman, but he was the tallest person I had ever seen. He had grey hair, beautifully combed and parted, not a hair out of place. But the most amazing thing about him was his legs. They went from the ground right up to his armpits, just a short body on top of these amazing legs. In fact, his initials were JL, and some people said they stood for Junior Legs Murray. Others called him Daddy Longlegs. He had quite a high-pitched voice, and when we were in big school, we went to morning parade every day. Mr. Murray would stand at the top of the steps in front of the vestibule that ran through the middle of the school with its big model of a ship in a glass case, and he'd give orders. Attention! Stand at ease! Then he'd make the announcements, and 2 big kids would pull the flag up the flagpole, all folded up. At his signal, they would jerk one of the ropes, and the flag would magically unfold. At exactly the same time, in his office, which ran off the vestibule, another kid put on a record of God Save the King, and we all stood to attention till it was over. After that, we'd march to our classrooms. A few years later, I wrote, as we got bigger, Ironsides got better. First, they finished the 2nd story on the big school. Then they built another school the size of Little School. Then came a driveway from the big brick gates to the main steps and around the new flagpole, which was much taller than the old one. They put in some new tennis courts, and they fenced the top of the oval. Next thing, there were new cricket nets made of heavy wire. They started a band, and we learned to play the fife and the drum. Now we'd actually play God Save the King, or maybe God Save the Queen, while Mr. Murray sang it. Then we'd play Cock of the North or some other Scottish tune as everyone marched into school. They just couldn't stop changing things. But we didn't mind. We were having great fun. My mother wanted me to talk like Mr. Menzies, so once a week I had to go to elocution. Miss Guyatt from the Methodist Church taught it in a classroom under the main school. How now, brown cow, he would say. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. We'd learn poems. breathe from our diaphragms, place our feet at 45-degree angles, and speak very clearly indeed, so everyone could hear you at the back of the class. But of course, the best thing was cricket and footy. I loved both, and with teachers like Mr. Kinnan and Mr. England, especially Mr. Kinnan, I loved learning new things. Mr. Kinnan had been in the Air Force, and at first he rode a motorbike to school. We had him 2 years in a row, and if we performed well in our mental arithmetic, in the afternoon he'd tell us stories about the adventures of Bruce and Chigwigwi. Bruce was a bit like the Phantom, but without the costume. He rode a white horse, and Chigwigwi would run alongside, holding on to the saddle as they chased the bad guys through the jungle. I have absolutely no doubt that it was these stories that inspired my love and devotion to the flowing narrative, so that when I came to write my own books, even the most complex histories or biographies, the most important element was the narrative that kept the reader engaged in the story and drove it to a climax. It was Mr. Kinnan who made me cricket captain and probably recommended me to be in the Queensland footy team and ducks of the school. And in the final year, I was joint school captain with, I think, the lovely Janice Cribb. I owe him a debt, as indeed I owe Ironside, that I cannot ever adequately repay. In fact, by the time I left to go to Brisbane Grammar, I was really on top of the world. And when the troubles of adolescence arrived, and I fell out with the BGS headmaster, and things were tough at home, when my mother contracted cancer of the blood, it was that sense of confidence and inner resources that Ironsides had imparted me that saw me through. It took me jackarooing in Western Queensland, into journalism at the Courier Mail, when it was a real newspaper, into the office of the Deputy Prime Minister, John Blackjack McEwen, just before Harold Holt took his fateful swim. And as you may imagine, the life of a writer, even the most celebrated authors, is one of insecurity, critical attacks, vigorous reviews, erratic sales, as well as all the problems of a solitary life at the computer. But once again, Ironsides provided the rock on which my career was built, just as it was for the classmates of our year, which we always thought of as being a bit special. This provided a bond that proved to be remarkably enduring. In our scholarship year, grade 8, hardly a Saturday evening passed without one of us having a birthday party to which most were invited. They were delightful, if terrifying affairs, as we began that fearsome journey into adolescence, and our party games reflected this. One, I recall, had the girls behind a set of curtains taking turns to slide out a leg so we could guess the owner of each lissom limb. And as I remember, there were quite a few surprises. But the all-time favourite was Winks. That's when we arranged a circle of chairs, and all but one had a girl and a boy, a girl sitting and a boy standing behind. The other one had a boy behind but no girl. He would look around the seated girls and give a wink. She would instantly try to leave her chair for his, while the boy behind her tried to take hold of her to remain in the chair. The fumbling attempts to keep the girl often meant that hands reached where they otherwise wouldn't, and it was all rather titillating. Even better was when the boys sat on the chairs with the girls behind. I don't suppose Winks is high on the list of 13-year-olds' party games these days, but it was one of the ties that bound us then, and so firm were they that over the years we had a series of reunions, including a 50th, where the turn-up was truly remarkable, and no one had changed a bit. That was some 20 years ago, and I can't help but feel that changes have occurred since then. It might even be that we've lost some of our friends and classmates in the interim. But for those of us who remain, however long, the memories of our special cohort are as bright as ever. So too is that wonderful sense of a closing circle. The last few years have been kind to me, and my career as I've explored in print the horrors and the wonders of our colonial times in a quartet of books. My last work, Cast Away, became a bestseller, and it bids fair to become a television series in the next little while. So too my first novel, The Queenslander, in which Ironside also plays a part. That is almost as good as being named Captain of Ironside, but not nearly as good as having been asked to give the keynote address on the 150th anniversary of our great school. And for that, with all my heart, I thank you.